Okay, so we're going to be taking a look through GraphXR. It's a knowledge graph software. It's good for several things. It's good for having a very exciting visual 3D space display where you can put multiple nodes in and you can organize them in shapes like spheres and also other shapes as well, like spirals and cubes, and along in a sequential line. And this is also going to be used by me for a project I've been doing, which is spanning and bridging East and West in terms of Buddhism, in terms of comparison and contrast, for example. So those are some of the things that I'd like to take a look at while exploring the potential for using this software and see how well it is suited to the task. So the overview of the topics will be to do with ancient wisdom and the philosophies therein, the Enlightenment and the Revolution, modernity and science, and cultural exchange and synthesis, and contemporary challenges and opportunities. These are some of the ways which we can look about this bridging idea. And hopefully the graph system is one way where we can start to take a look. Here's our 3D world, so with the map. That's one way we can approach this. Literally east and literally west. That's one of the ways we can look at it. For example, there are the cliched Eastern values. Let's look at some of those which you might hear people referring to or assuming. It's not always the case, and there are many exceptions to any rule. So, for example, the collective mentality is emphasized in the East, and peacefulness. The emphasis on inner personal nature rather than the scientific quite so much. The duty orientation, equality, and fate and destiny is often associated, and the universe being self-evolving, self-organizing. That often that the mind and body are one unit is an idea that's sometimes associated. It's not categorical. Let's look at a few others in that set. So this sphere is a way of organizing ideas together. I met Fritjof Capra one time in Japan in an airport. So yeah, the different manifestations of the same ultimate reality, right? So one of the kind of gist of things. And these ideas were picked up all over the world at different times and places, even with the German Romantics, as we'll take a look later on. Accepting of fate is another one. Let's go down a little bit more, and then we'll move on, because there's also there are the Western equivalents that philosophy is meant to be sedative rather than provocative. For example, the harmony of opposing viewpoints. You get this with Carl Jung's theories, the yin and yang, and it being all about mind as opposed to scientific nature. The retreat to the forest. And this high amount of conformity, the sort of ant mentality that we see, for example, in Taiwan with Tzu Foundation. So let's take a look at some sort of complementary opposites that we see in Western values. So here's a similar kind of viewpoint, which is with the West, again, cliches. There are so many exceptions to these rules. They're not rules. They're just often typical, I think. But when people have been on the spiritual path, you do tend to see a lot of this emphasized one way or the other. That the West tends to be a little bit more selfish and prone to divisive quarreling, and there's an external focus in the spirituality, that it's scientific, that it's focused on physics and chemistry and biology, on the universe. Often we get conflicting views between disciplines. It needs to be very precise and very factual, very often mathematical, and the interest in one's own personal growth is there. And so there are some of the, again, cliches and many multiple exceptions to the rule. The idea that everything is random as well, because of atheism, when you take in the idea of a meaning-driven universe that has a sort of loving parent behind it, shaping and influencing it, which is the religious viewpoint, the theistic viewpoint, that it uses a very critical and doubting sort of approach, as opposed to a very faith-driven emphasis. The emphasis on choice, on technology mastery, and feelings being interpreted as expressions of our own inner nature, and the emphasis on freedom and rights, and the focus again on natural laws and knowledge. So these are generalizations. You do find all of these things in the East. The idea of fighting wrongs and fighting for rights being conflated together with spirituality is something that we notice a lot. The emphasis on control over nature that we see coming out since the empiricists and the rationalists and the Enlightenment time, again, as opposed to submission to the will of God. So those are some generalities. If we go back to the East, let's look at some overall ideas that club together as Eastern philosophy. A very generalized, broad view, and very many of them here. We'll be looking at 127 nodes, not all of them obviously, but you can see some of the things that start to come under. The Art of War by Sun Tzu, for example, judo and martial arts with Shaolin, Kung Fu, calligraphy, Buddhism, and many different other aspects of disciplines that come under it, like dance and decorative knotwork, dragons, which have a very spiritual emphasis as well. In Chinese culture also, swordsmanship. And let's go down a little bit. So it covers multiple cultures when we talk. You know, the Taiwanese or Tibetans are in there, Hong Kong, China, and mainland China, Korea. So there's a great, enormous amount of cultures of great difference to one another as well. Let's just look what else is included in amongst there. Yeah, across great spans of time as well. Good, so let's let go of that particular icon and go cruising off into our conceptual space, having a muse and a fly through the thought streams and collections of ideas here, which is a very enjoyable experience. Something like flying through a city at night, or having a drone and flying through the air. I enjoy it. So some of the people who may be included in something like this may be, say for example, let's take a look. Confucius is a key player. That's the anglicised spelling. And yeah, just some broad introductory facts about So yes, the Confucius as it's spelt is a very anglicised version. Confucianism, very influential in Chinese society, and Confucius's ideas emphasised harmony and order in society. He promoted the silver rule: do not do unto others what you wouldn't want to have done to yourself. And he himself considered himself someone who was transmitting ancient values forward and protecting them. So he stressed correctness in relationships and roles, like father to son, son to father, father to wife, younger brother to elder brother, and siblings. And this is different, again, to an approach to a teaching as compared with many of the teachings that we see in the West after the Enlightenment. There isn't anything like this kind of moralistic approach, or this recommending of roles. That's sort of in the role of religion, and we see that separation of religion and sciences there. So another is the big influencer in Asia would be the teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha Dharma teachings. So let's go out. All of these spheres contain a discipline or a topic or some emphasis. So Buddha Dharma teachings are enormous in their scope, and that's a testament to their durability, both culturally and their emphasis and their relevance and their ability to be applied in many places and times as well, which is often different when you emphasize, for example, a technology, like the microscope or a certain form of boat or plane or transportation or anything with it's sort of mechanical and is exterior, has a comparative limit and is soon out of date. There are many different aspects of the Buddha's teachings. Too many in a brief oversight that we'll be doing here. The life of the Buddha was way back 2550. There's actually 550 BC. Let's take a look at Buddhist teachings. Some of the Mahayana Buddhism is another aspect. There are many different schools, and this is influenced right up to contemporary times. We've got this. I've got here Buddhist influenced movies. Either the actors are Buddhist or the themes themselves. Let's take a look at those in a little while. Let's have a look at some of the influences on the Dharma later on as well, on the Western culture. Let's go take a look at this one here. An overview of just some Buddhist terms, just to run the idea around and refresh ideas that we may have seen, and also get familiar with this medium. So there are all kinds, when people become a Buddhist, they start becoming familiar with all these terms which stem from Pali and Sanskrit languages. And then the whole cosmology of ideas in there, such as dukkha and anicca, anatta, universal characteristics of that everybody will face suffering, that everybody cannot cling to a permanent self that doesn't change, and that everything changes. The practice and the idea of bhavana, of cultivation as well. The celestial cosmology involved with Buddhism and how it applies to people. go up a level and see what's up there. The Shramaneras, the Samanas, the wandering monks with their bowls and robes and shaven heads. All kinds of different aspects that we can connect and become more familiar with. Okay, let's release from that. It's a nice Buddhist way to approach concepts, ability to better go into them, take a look at them, and then let go. All right, so beginning with the ancient wisdom and the philosophies, the Four Noble Truths, that there is suffering in life, that there is causes of suffering, that there is a cessation of suffering, and there's a path to get there. It's not all the will of a divine entity, and it can be approached scientifically as well. It's a very much in a form of scientific method, though we have to be careful with that. So these things, such as the Taoism and the Four Noble Truths and Confucian ethics, have been shaping Eastern civilizations for a great amount of time. And that's in contrast to the West, which got a lot of influence from people such as the ancient Greek schools of philosophy. And it's worth familiarizing yourself with what the ancient Greeks were attempting to understand in order to make a comparison. So there are a great many of these ancient Greek schools and individuals within them across different sort of eras and spans of time, like Pythagoras there, who was more or less a sort of cult leader, and Pythagoras. And he was making a curious mixture of astrology, mathematics, and music, and then coming up with ideas such as the music of the spheres. He actually had a following with a rudimentary ruling of discipline, a kind of rule of living, which is some of which is quite unusual, as most rules are, like not to urinate facing the sun, because that's offensive to the sun, and not to keep a sparrow indoors was another one, and flatulence was seen as unspiritual, so therefore forbidden. So a great many people in there, but some of the major names, like if you remember the acronym SPA, SPA, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, those are in sequence. So those are a good anchor point to start from. Socrates, the elder of them, Plato, the middle, and Aristotle, the younger one. Aristotle more emphasizing on natural laws, so much more in a way scientific. Plato much more visionary and almost a little bit more spiritual in that sense. He was more dealing with the inner world, with his famous ideal forms and his quite unusual analogy of the cave, as civilization as being people living within a cave, and they are jumping and alarmed at the shadows that are thrown from the fire on the wall, and then one person goes outside and sees the reality as it really is, and he's no longer bound by the flickering, alarming sights projected by his imagination onto the walls of his mind. So, and then Socrates, who was portrayed as a very gentle person, but who probed verbally as he went around, and he believed in probing further and further and further to find the truth. But this irritated a lot of people, and it also unveiled a lot of their hypocrisies and shallowness, so that made him both friends and enemies. And he was finally hauled in court and then ordered, after a bogus sort of kangaroo court, to be sentenced to death by hemlock which he actually accepted. Other people would have just left the city, but he went that sort of martyr route. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Greeks. Comparative to the Buddha, difficult to say. I mean, the Buddha was much better organisation and understanding the necessity of structured rules in order for the longevity of his teaching. His teaching was also very much more complete, whereas a lot of the other ones were works in progress of the Greeks, or they were speculating into metaphysics, like the substances of the universe and substances of the soul and the spirit, and conflating the two things. Some of them, like they were saying that the whole world is made of water, or all substances and all realities are derived from water, or derived from fire. So quite a work in progress, or a sort of speculative approach. Some of them had, they were in times of the Buddha, they were unruly. Diogenes, for example, was a very shocking person who lived a very wild, rampant kind of life in public, and the idea there of sort of throwing away all your inhibitions and living a really sort of fearless, reckless, sort of wild life was what he advocated in terms of pleasure. And we also had people in India around the Buddha who were living similar philosophies, and the kings and the rulers and the emperors started to see the difference that the effects these people going around were having on their cultures, and that's why they became very respectful also of the Buddha. Okay, so let's let go of the ancient Greek schools of philosophy there, and let's move on to the second part, the Enlightenment. There's the ancient of Enlightenment thinkers themselves. Then there's different aspects they were dealing with, and of course they were dealing with a very heavy precedent, which was the age of the power of religion, where there was a very cruel and dominant religious atmosphere before them that was very anti-scientific, and it was aiming to suppress as much as it could this sort of probing into what they were calling truths. Copernicus and Galileo, these were people who were pushing the boundaries of what had been told as truth. And so this era was an era of transition, also between understanding based on superstitious beliefs or religious dogmas. So you got the age of exorcism, the age of believing demons and spirits and devils as the cause, as a first cause of events. And there was the transition there via mesmerism and hypnosis, and the belief in speculative ideas about magnetism and electricity and the life force. So all those were coming as the sheer scale of the universe started to become more revealed. Then some of the ideas about the theocentric versions of what life and the planets and the universe are, that started to knock a lot of the credibility out of the power of the church and their version of events and the version of cosmology. And some of those versions, because they started to get then replaced by new versions of spirituality. like with the German Romantics, for example, they would start to say, yes, the universe is infinite. It's not a cozy little nest that God has built for us. It is infinite, but whereas before it was a universe that had meaning, like a cot with loving parents holding it. Now it's this huge, endless, vast thing of stones rolling around in space. That some of those versions started to get changed, where God is still there and he's still behind it, or he still is it, or he's an invisible force that moves through it. So you got various versions that started to emerge around there, which were also much more like spirituality in New Age mysticism, where you have your own personal sort of version of your connection to it, rather than through the power of the church, which obviously was one of the things that the church was keen on not losing. So some of the names there: Jeremy Bentham, Bacon, and a lot of the early astronomers and physicists, and many of whom also started to enroll in Freemasonry. Hume. These were people who had the courage and the capacity at that time also to start to speak openly out and refute the idea of a universe controlled by one God, a universe and a soul which is eternal, afterlife, and these were ideas being disputed and just outright denied, and they were getting away with doing that without getting the execution of the Inquisition and being treated publicly as heretics and so on. Okay, so those are some of the Enlightenment thinkers. Those fly out a little bit. So people like Rousseau was one, for example, who started to bring out new theories and ideas, and this became quite vogue across Europe and the West, and these strongly influenced one another. Rousseau had a great belief in a sort of romantic naturism view. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here he is in France. Not sure if the map is going to swamp us as we come around to look where he is. We might have to reverse back out through the map in a moment. Yeah, let's just push out. So there in France, amongst quite a group of other people of that time. Let's do a search also on the data. So we want Rousseau. Oops, I've done a spelling mistake, I think. Yeah, Rousseau, here we go. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, social and political philosopher, one place that he shows up as. He put a lot of emphasis on new ideas and approaches to children's education, and he also really emphasized caring and nurturing and the powerful effect of play and recreation, which was a revolution, because you'd had a lot of religious influences coming out and saying, the head versions of reality where human reality was seen as a form of punishment and as a form of a result of crime, that all humans were born out of sin. So this was quite a revolution, where the idea that children should be loved was quite a revolution. It was sort of a new form. So these new philosophies coming out were a big aspect. Important thinker, but not without his controversial aspect as well. So we can just go to the second one. No, obviously not. That's us back there. Age of Enlightenment Thinkers, which we've seen. Social and political philosophy is why I wanted to go to that. So that's the one with. We were already there. So in Western philosophers. So yeah, this is putting him on a line of thinkers, important people. His idea of the social contract is very important, that can people be trusted and do they understand? And he believed that they do. He believed very much in the inner constitution of people. So having a look at also his time is important, 1712, 1778. So we're just around about at his death, around about the time of the Industrial Revolution. So quite enough. So now we're just going to be looking a little bit. I just want to see whether these are time organized. Yeah, they're organized by their year of birth. That's right. So just introduce you to some of the other ways that this can be used. Okay, so that's the Enlightenment and the Revolution. Let's move on to modernity and science as well. So we have, with science, we have also the timeline I'd like to have a look at. Scientific discoveries, so a change of spelling. Excuse me. Scientific timeline. Let's go take a look at that. Because that had a very big influence. The influence of the telescope we were discussing a bit earlier on. Let's look at some of the kind of things that were happening. Here we are in the middle of our line, so 1620s. We're going a little bit backwards. Actually, I mean, we could turn around and, oops, that's not quite doing what I was hoping for. So let's just get it centered first of all. Yeah, here we go. So I would like to go a bit forward because we're actually talking about the 1780s-ish. That's kind of where we got. So Galileo Galilei, the laws of falling bodies, that's 1638. A little bit later, we get things like the barometer. So people really getting on top of how do the natural laws work, and being able to move beyond the idea of a anthropomorphic power behind everything. Isaac Newton discovers that white light is a mixture of distinct coloured rays. So a lot of things become demystified. Leibniz and Newton, the infinitesimal calculus, microscopes being used, measurements of the speed of light. Isaac Newton, fundamental forces of gravity, fundamental laws of gravity. The classification of nature started to really happen in a very big way as well. That lightning is electrical, it's not a punishment of God or a threat from the cloud angels or something. Discovery of oxygen, 1781. Planets being discovered. The properties of digitalis. So here we are in the 1790s. The extinction of species. smallpox, general anesthesia. So enormous strides during that time. So that's the period we're looking at about them. Lamarckianism, and still theories and ideas being posited, most of which, or many of which, certainly to do with body and mind, were discredited later on. So then we have Einstein, people such as Freud, let's have a look for Sigmund Freud. Ooh, too many. So an enormously influential person, and he's in that interim period between mesmerism, hypnotism, and talking cures. So there's this sort of transition, and where introspection and the inner world and the unconscious start to become very much more of interest. It's a very interesting period to study, particularly for meditators. Many people, I think, would disagree with that, but I've personally found it of great interest and benefit to take a look at the ideas purely from the idea, because we're raised very much in the West through the lens of these ideas, whether you're talking about, I don't know, modern comedies, or that come out from a place like New York, which has an enormous culture of therapy involved, and so the dialogues, the humor, the understanding, the influences, the inferences of the humor. That's oops. Let me go back again. And many of the ideas that our sort of parents and school teachers were sort of being influenced by, about the structure of the mind and the structure of the personality, and the way that the personality and childhood development works. A controversial person, particularly the feminists took great offence to his Oedipus complex and the whole sort of male-centric, Eurocentric approach that he took. Many other things. He died of personal suicide, essentially, voluntary euthanasia. He was using cocaine for a 10-year period of his life, and there were a great many controversies. He's often contrasted with Carl Jung, whereas Freud was an atheist who believed in a sort of tabula rasa, that we were born a blank slate and just programmed, whereas Jung was a theist and pantheist, in fact, quite contrasted. So it's an interesting study about to look at the contrast between them. Nowadays, most people do not practice his methods. There are some people who still practice it, but it's not nearly as widely in use. It's very long and very deep and very probing into a person's personal depth, which has its advantages and disadvantages. But there are many good media, like films, movies, documentaries now that you can see, things like he had the Wolfman, for example, the Sergei Pankev case. is been dramatized, and many others as well. You should. It's worth checking those out. Very influential in this forming of some way to deal with civilization and its discontents, to cite one of his books. So that's one of our people. Let's say someone else who might be influential. We could say Nietzsche would be one. Friedrich Nietzsche. He is someone for whom the atheistic temperament of the time and the nihilism. Let's go and take a look at the nihilistic sphere. And nihilism, when you remove God and you remove morality, which if you totally associate it only with the Catholic Church, for example, you have an effect. And Nietzsche was someone who took this wholeheartedly on. It probably contributed to his sense of doom and destruction in many ways. Nietzsche, he had a very sort of bleak outlook. He talked about looking in, being beware of staring into the abyss, unless the abyss comes back and stares into you. So that if you take away the meaningful universe, you can become very distressed and devoid. But he was also quite a indulgent person in many ways as well. So that may have contributed. I've heard various versions of how and why he died. But syphilis has been mentioned, but I've also heard it refuted. He's also often unfairly associated with Nazism. One of his key ideas was the will to power, which is this drive for excellence. And he certainly had visions of himself as being incredibly excellent and superior, far above everyone else. So this idea of the Übermensch, the Superman, that he was driving towards. So the idea of the talented mastermind. But as I said, unfortunately, this idea of the will to power was adopted by the Nazis. Largely his sister, who was his care assistant in elderly years, was going out with a Nazi, and his writings were taken and then sort of spin doctored into Nazi ideas. So the movie, what was her name? The director, Griefen or something. What was called that Hitler made about the Olympics and the portrayal of idealistic Germany with him as the Superman to save everybody and lead everyone into sort of greatness. The will to power, that was called the triumph of the will. So it's drinking out of the same well of ideas and thinking, this sort of super brilliance, and so on, that you can make yourself into that. So let's leave that alone for now. So a little bit about Freud and Nietzsche. And this modernity and science, and moving into the modern era in Europe. So there was much impact of the scientific discoveries, and Eastern worldviews didn't get a great look in. They were overshadowed by what was happening with Darwin. There were several people, Wilhelm Wundt was one, who tried to make a science of introspection. Or maybe I spelled it wrong. Is it one L? Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt. Yeah, and him and his student Tickner I have a lot of respect for, because they also are definitely moving in a similar direction as the Buddha would sympathize with. He is taking a scientific approach, a very methodical approach to... These are a bit bunched up. Let me just expand these out a little bit. Hello? What's that? Oh, hold on. I know what happened. Right. Let's go back again. Now they're all highlighted. Let's focus to them. Hope that didn't do anything weird. No. I think they already did the spread. Anyway, so let's just fly in a little bit and have a look at some of these ideas, what's written down here. Not so much about his ideas, it's a little bit more on the details of the places and times and so on. But he was the first person to set up an experimental laboratory where people were systematically asked about their responses, and they were recorded very methodically and scientifically. Edward Tickner also. So that they were doing something that you see in a lot of slightly later Buddhism, where there's a lot of methodical, numerical listing of elements and factors, which is not very popular with everyone. But people such as Sariputta, the key student of the Buddha, one of the right-hand disciples and leading teachers, was very much of a mind to do this very systematic categorizing of mental elements, to have very great clarity in structure of the mind. So that's something that Tickner and Wilhelm Wundt were doing, which was trying to create a science of a scientific approach, a science using a laboratory, clinical methods, a science of examining the mind in the same way that the people like Darwin and so on had used to categorize botany and so on. That's his effort to try to make a respectable science of introspection in a time where there was a lot of mysticism, a lot of speculation, and a lot of sensational, table tapping, channeling, and so on. And you had people like Jung, who were very much in favour of mysticizing, and he didn't want too much of a scientific approach, because he felt then that religion would get erased out, and the spiritual, mystical, imaginative, dreamy side of the inner world would get lost. There are other people who've been involved in the influencing and the transmission, also deliberate, direct, like almost missionary, in a sense of missionary, of the transmission of Buddhist ideas from the East directly to the West. Something that nowadays we take quite for granted. We've grown up in a time now where there's quite a lot of transmission, but D.T. Suzuki is one person, and I've got a strange feeling something's happened. Perhaps when I hit it expand, it's quite possible that every single thing, yeah, I thought so, has jumped. So that's just too bad. Never mind, that's life. Yeah, maybe if I now take that off and do a contract, there's just a chance it will all go back to where it was, but I doubt it. It's possible. have a look. So in that case, Suzuki would have jumped back to San Francisco. But like I said, that's a long shot. I don't know. What do you know? It actually worked. So there you go. There you go. Mastery. So D.T. Suzuki. He's not the only. He's not the only one. There were other people who were involved in transmission, such as William James, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Thoreau, with varying shades and degrees and influences. Not all of them so pure. They're quite a mixture of Hinduism and lots of different influences that Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, had. We'll just have a look at the threads, because there's quite a lot of threads linking to Ralph Waldo Emerson. I wouldn't mind seeing actually what they actually really are. Doesn't seem to be showing them. Here we go. It caught up with itself. So get rid of this one up here so we can actually see it a bit better. And I'm going to re-click Suzuki. Well, I just want any one of them clicked, because there's a big danger if nothing is clicked and you make an action, it affects everything. So, transcendentalism, very much a big influence, and also the German Romantics' views, and the view of the oneness of being. So these are big factors with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yeah, okay, not too much detail, unfortunately. Okay. All right, so let's wind that up for now. And just have a look at some of the Western influences that have taken place. Buddhist influences in Western culture. This is just a loose version of this. Some of the kind of things that happen, such as, let's go to one of that. Oh, well, yeah, let's have a look at those celebrity Westerners. Celebrity Western Buddhists. So this is, for example, people who are making influence. It's not a question of how Buddhist they are or how pure they're, how Buddhist really is, sort of David Bowie or Tina Turner. The main thing is that the will is there, the movement away from a single Christian-dominated culture. Robert Downey, Brad Pitt. So it carries a kudos and it carries a credibility of sorts, which it doesn't do any harm, basically, to endorse the teaching. Sting is a highly credible and respectable person. Angelina Jolie is a hard-working, talented people, and they've made that choice. So that again, it can create a kind of example for people to follow. and a good example in that sense. They're usually from moving away from the egoism of their profession towards caring, towards compassion, and they're usually expected to sort of exemplify that in many cases. And away from greed, and it seemed to be associated with more sobriety, consciousness, care for the world, care for people in poverty, and again, expected to be showing that as well, actively displaying it. So it's seen as a healthy aspect. And then some of the works that they produce as well. And for example, many of the people that we saw there were in the movies. So Buddhist influenced movies. I know there's 2 of these. Which one's the bigger one? That one. Not far away, I think. Their works also very influential. So many of the ideas within, or supposed to be within Buddhism, often get communicated through movies, or the stories, or the incredible sort of events and the transformations in people's lives, or historical events. Many of those get through, and again, it's positivity. It's seen as a very positive aspect of the dare I call it a religion. We need to go over a little bit. Let's see all those. So you get the idea, and so I hope you've enjoyed this little tour through East and West, a little bridge. Just going to let go now, letting go of the razor's edge. So, as I say, I hope that you've enjoyed yourself, and we'll be doing more of these little explanations and explorations of the knowledge map here. And take care. Hope to come on more journeys like this one again together.